The morning sun rose slowly over Buckingham Palace, painting the ancient stone walls in shades of gold and amber. The birds sang their morning songs in the perfectly trimmed gardens, and the flags flew high above the grand building. It was a day that seemed ordinary in every way. The guards stood at their posts, their red uniforms bright against the gray morning mist. The servants moved through the corridors with practiced silence, carrying silver trays and fresh flowers. Nobody could have imagined that before the sun would set, an event would occur that would shake the very foundations of the royal family and leave the entire nation in disbelief. Queen Camilla woke up that morning with a strange feeling in her heart. She could not explain it, but something felt different. The air seemed heavier somehow, and even the familiar comfort of her private chambers felt foreign to her. She sat up in her bed and looked around the room. The paintings on the walls showed scenes of royal history, of kings and queens who had come before her. She wondered, as she often did, if she truly belonged among them. Her journey to become queen had been long and filled with pain. She remembered the early days when the whole world seemed to hate her. She remembered the cruel words in the newspapers, the angry faces of the crowds, the way people would turn away when she walked past. She had loved Charles for so many years, but that love had come at a terrible price. She had been called names that still hurt her heart when she thought about them. She had been blamed for things that were far more complicated than anyone wanted to understand. But time had changed many things. Slowly, very slowly, some people had begun to see her differently. They saw how she stood beside Charles through his difficult moments. They saw how she worked hard to support causes she believed in. They saw how she never complained, never fought back against the hatred, but simply kept going day after day. And when Charles finally became king, she became his queen. Not everyone accepted her, but enough people had softened their hearts to make her feel that perhaps, just perhaps, she had earned her place. The crown she would wear today was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of everything she had survived and everything she had achieved. It represented her transformation from the most hated woman in Britain to the queen consort. Every diamond in that crown seemed to hold a tear she had cried over the years. Every golden curve represented a battle she had fought and won. Today she was to wear it at a special ceremony, and she felt both proud and nervous. Her lady-in-waiting, Margaret, entered the room with a gentle knock. Margaret had served Camilla for over 15 years. She knew every mood of the queen, every worry that crossed her mind. This morning, she could see that something was troubling her mistress. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Margaret said softly, setting down a tray of tea. "Did you sleep well?" Camilla smiled, but the smile did not quite reach her eyes. "I had strange dreams, Margaret. Dreams of running through endless corridors, searching for something I could never find." Margaret poured the tea with steady hands. "Perhaps it is just the nerves about today's ceremony. It is a big day after all." "Perhaps," Camilla agreed, though she was not convinced. She had attended hundreds of ceremonies over the years. She had learned to control her nerves, to present a calm face to the world no matter what storms raged inside her. But today felt different. Today, something in the air whispered of change. In another part of the palace, a young man was getting ready for his shift. His name was Thomas Ashworth, and he was 28 years old. He had been a royal guard for 6 years, following in the footsteps of his father and his grandfather before him. The Ashworth family had served the crown for 3 generations, and Thomas had always felt immense pride in continuing that tradition. Thomas stood before his mirror, adjusting his uniform with careful precision. Every button had to be perfectly aligned. Every crease had to be sharp and clean. The bearskin hat sat beside him, ready to be placed on his head. He looked at his reflection and saw a young man who appeared confident and strong. But inside, Thomas carried a weight that nobody knew about. He carried a secret that had haunted him for years, a truth that connected him to the royal family in a way that nobody could have imagined. His mother had told him the story when he was 21 years old. She had sat him down in their small kitchen, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears. and she had told him something that had changed his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his life. "Your father," she had said, her voice breaking. "The man who raised you, who loved you, who taught you to be the man you are. He was not your biological father." Thomas had stared at her in shock. James Ashworth had been his hero, his mentor, his best friend. James had died when Thomas was 18, and Thomas had mourned him deeply. The thought that James was not his real father seemed impossible to accept. "Then who?" Thomas had asked, his voice barely a whisper. And his mother had told him a story that seemed to come from a fairy tale, except it was not a fairy tale at all. It was a story of forbidden love, of a brief affair that should never have happened, of a woman who had made a choice that had shaped the rest of her life. Thomas's biological father, his mother had revealed, was connected to the highest levels of British society. A man who could never acknowledge him, who could never claim him, who did not even know he existed. His mother had been a young woman working at one of the royal estates when she had met this man. They had fallen in love, or what felt like love in those passionate, reckless days of youth. But the affair had ended quickly, and she had discovered she was pregnant only after it was over. She had married James Ashworth, a kind and decent man who knew the truth but loved her anyway. He had raised Thomas as his own son, never once treating him as anything less than his flesh and blood. And Thomas had grown up believing the story was closed, finished, nothing more than a sad chapter in his mother's past. But then his mother had shown him a photograph, an old photograph faded and worn from being handled too many times. And in that photograph, Thomas had seen the face of his biological father, a face that he recognized, a face that appeared in newspapers and on television screens, a face that was connected to the very palace where Thomas now served. The revelation had shaken Thomas to his core. For years, he had struggled with what to do with this information. Part of him wanted to forget it, to pretend his mother had never told him, to continue living his life as Thomas Ashworth, the proud royal guard with a simple family history. But another part of him burned with questions. Who was he really? What did it mean to carry this secret? And did the royal family have any right to know about his existence? He had chosen to say nothing. He had continued his work, standing guard outside palace gates, watching the comings and goings of people who were, in some distant way, his relatives. He had seen Queen Camilla many times, had stood at attention as she walked past, had watched her smile at the crowds, and he had felt a strange mixture of emotions each time. She did not know him. She did not know that he carried a secret that could potentially cause a scandal. She did not know that the young guard who stood so still and silent had a story that connected him to the very foundations of her new position. But today something had changed inside Thomas. He had received news the previous evening that had pushed him to a decision. His mother was dying. The doctors had given her only a few weeks to live. And on her deathbed, she had made him promise something that he was not sure he could fulfill. "You have to tell the truth, Thomas," she had said, gripping his hand with what little strength she had left. "Before I die, I need to know that you will not carry this burden alone for the rest of your life. You deserve to be acknowledged. You deserve to know who you really are." Thomas had wept at her bedside. He had not wanted to make this promise. He knew that speaking the truth could destroy his career, could cause a scandal that would hurt many people, could change his life in ways he could not predict. But his mother had looked at him with such desperation, such love, such hope, that he had finally nodded his head. "I promise," he had whispered. And now here he was, on the morning of a major royal ceremony, getting ready for a shift that could become the most significant moment of his life. He did not have a detailed plan. He only knew that he could not keep silent any longer. The weight of the secret had become too heavy to bear. The ceremony was scheduled to take place at noon. It was an event celebrating a historic anniversary, and dignitaries from around the world would be in attendance. The crown jewels would be on display, including the crown that Queen Camilla would wear. Security had been planning for months. Every possible threat had been analyzed and addressed. No one had considered the possibility that the threat might come from within, from one of their own guards. Thomas reported for duty at 9 o'clock. He was assigned to the inner chamber where the crown jewels were being kept before the ceremony. This was a position of great trust, given only to guards with impeccable records. Thomas had never given anyone reason to doubt his loyalty. His evaluations were excellent. His supervisors praised his dedication and professionalism. Nobody suspected that behind his calm exterior, a storm was raging. The crown sat on its velvet cushion, glittering under the soft lights. Thomas stood at his post, his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. But his mind was churning with thoughts. He thought about his mother, lying in her hospital bed, counting down the days she had left. He thought about his father, James Ashworth, the man who had loved him without reservation, who had given him a name and a home and a sense of belonging. He thought about the biological father who did not know he existed, who had lived a life of privilege while Thomas's mother had struggled to keep their secret. And he thought about Queen Camilla and the crown she would soon wear. In Thomas's troubled mind, that crown had come to represent everything that was wrong with the world he lived in. It represented secrets and lies, hidden truths and public masks. It represented a system that protected the powerful and left people like his mother to suffer in silence. He knew his thinking was not entirely rational. He knew that Queen Camilla herself had done nothing wrong, that she had no knowledge of his existence or his pain. But emotions are not always rational, and Thomas's emotions had been building for years. The hours passed slowly. More guards arrived to take their positions. Servants bustled about, making final preparations. The tension in the palace grew as the ceremony approached. Thomas stood perfectly still, breathing slowly, trying to calm his racing heart. He had made no plans for what he would do or when he would do it. He was waiting for a sign, a moment, something that would tell him the time was right. At 11 o'clock, Queen Camilla arrived in the chamber to inspect the crown before the ceremony. She was accompanied by her ladies-in-waiting and several senior palace officials. She was dressed beautifully, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup elegant and understated. She smiled as she entered the room, but Thomas, who had learned to read faces after years of standing guard, could see that her smile hid something. Perhaps worry, perhaps doubt, perhaps the same strange feeling she had woken up with that morning. Camilla walked slowly toward the crown, her eyes fixed on its brilliant diamonds. She reached out a hand but did not touch it, as if she were afraid it might burn her. Thomas watched her from his post, and he felt something unexpected stir in his chest. Not hatred, not anger, but something that felt almost like recognition. She looked like a woman who understood suffering. She looked like a woman who knew what it meant to be judged and found wanting. For a brief moment, Thomas felt a connection to her that surprised him. But then he remembered his mother's words, her desperate plea, the promise he had made. And the moment of connection faded, replaced by the heavy weight of duty. Not his duty to the crown or the palace, but his duty to his mother, to his own identity, to the truth that had been buried for too long. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than an hour. Soon, hundreds of people would gather in the grand hall. Television cameras would broadcast the event to millions of viewers around the world. Queen Camilla would place that glittering crown upon her head and smile for the cameras. And nobody would know the secret that one of her guards carried in his heart. Thomas made his decision. He would not stay silent any longer. He would not let his mother die with this burden unresolved. He would find a way to speak the truth, no matter what consequences might follow. The world might hate him for what he was about to do. The palace might throw him in prison. His family name might be destroyed forever. But at least he would be free. At least he would no longer carry the weight of a secret that had shaped his entire life. The minutes ticked by. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The guards stood at attention, the servants hurried about, and Queen Camilla returned to her chambers to make her final preparations. And Thomas Ashworth stood at his post, his heart pounding, his mind made up, waiting for the moment when he would change everything. Nobody in the palace suspected what was coming. Nobody could have imagined that the perfectly disciplined young guard with the proud family history was about to do something that would shock the nation. The morning had seemed so ordinary, so calm, so routine. But within hours, that calm would be shattered. Within hours, the world would witness something that had never happened before in the long history of the British monarchy. A royal guard would seize the Queen's crown, and the reason behind his action would leave everyone stunned. The clock on the wall showed 11:30. Half an hour until the ceremony began. Half an hour until Camilla would walk into the grand hall and take her place beside the king. Half an hour until the crown would be placed upon her head. And half an hour until Thomas Ashworth would make a choice that would echo through history. He closed his eyes for just a moment, remembering his mother's face, his father's kind hands, the photograph that had changed everything. He thought about all the years he had spent pretending, performing, playing the role of the loyal guard with no secrets. He was tired of pretending. He was ready for the truth. When he opened his eyes, his vision seemed clearer than it had ever been. The crown sparkled on its cushion, and Thomas knew that before this day was over, he would hold that crown in his hands. Not to steal it, not to keep it, but to make a statement that could not be ignored. He would force the world to listen to a story that had been silenced for too long. The final countdown had begun. The palace corridors hummed with activity as servants and officials rushed to complete the last preparations for the ceremony. Flower arrangements were adjusted with careful precision. Security personnel spoke into their radios, coordinating the movement of dignitaries who had begun arriving at the palace gates. Everything appeared to be proceeding exactly according to plan. In her private chambers, Queen Camilla sat before her mirror while her hairdresser made tiny adjustments to her elegant style. Her reflection stared back at her, a woman who had weathered storms that would have broken others. She thought about the crown she would soon wear, about the weight of it on her head, about the weight of responsibility it represented. "Your Majesty seems distracted today," her hairdresser observed gently. Camilla managed a small smile. "Just thinking about the ceremony, about what it means." What it meant was something she had contemplated many times. It meant she had survived. It meant she had endured years of public hatred and had somehow emerged on the other side. It meant that love, stubborn and persistent, had won in the end. But it also meant that she carried the memories of everyone who had been hurt along the way. She carried the knowledge that her happiness had come at a cost to others. And she carried the constant awareness that not everyone had forgiven her, that perhaps some never would. If she had known what was about to happen, if she had known that one of the guards standing outside her door carried a secret that connected him to her family in ways she could not imagine, she might have felt differently about this day. But she did not know. She could not know. And so she sat before her mirror, unaware that her world was about to be turned upside down. In the chamber where the crown jewels were kept, Thomas Ashworth remained at his post. His training kept his body perfectly still, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. But inside, his thoughts were a whirlwind of memories and emotions. He remembered the day he had first put on the guard's uniform. His mother had cried with pride, and James, the man he called father, had shaken his hand with tears in his eyes. "You're carrying on a proud tradition, son," James had said. 3 generations of Ashworths serving the crown. Your grandfather would be so proud. Thomas had felt proud too in that moment. He had felt like he belonged to something bigger than himself, a chain of service and duty that stretched back through history. He had not yet learned the truth about his biological father. He had not yet understood that his connection to the crown was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The truth had changed everything. It had made him question every decision he had ever made, every belief he had held about himself. Was his desire to serve the crown truly his own, or had it been somehow inherited from a father he had never met? Was he drawn to this life because of his family tradition, or because of blood he had never known about? These questions had tormented him for years, and now, with his mother dying and time running out, he felt a desperate need to find answers. He needed to confront the truth, whatever consequences might follow. He needed to step out of the shadows and into the light. The clock now showed 11:45, 15 minutes until the ceremony. Outside the palace, crowds had gathered to watch the dignitaries arrive. Flags waved in the gentle breeze. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, hoping to catch a glimpse of the royal family. The atmosphere was festive, celebratory, filled with excitement and anticipation. Thomas heard the distant sound of cheering as another important guest arrived. He heard the clicking of heels in the corridor as palace officials hurried past. He heard the muffled conversations of other guards, stationed at posts throughout the building, all of them prepared to ensure that the ceremony proceeded without incident. None of them knew that the incident they were guarding against would come from within their own ranks. None of them knew that the young guard with the impeccable record was about to do something that would leave them all in shock. Thomas thought about what would happen after. He knew he would be arrested. He knew he would face severe consequences. But he also knew that his action would create a moment that could not be ignored. The media would descend like vultures. Questions would be asked. And eventually the truth would have to come out. He was not naive enough to think that his biological father would welcome him with open arms. He was not foolish enough to believe that the royal family would embrace him as one of their own. But he hoped, perhaps desperately, that at least someone would listen. At least someone would understand. At least his mother could die knowing that her son had finally found the courage to claim his identity. The final minutes ticked away. The ceremony was about to begin, and Thomas Ashworth stood at his post, gathering his courage for the moment that would change everything. He thought about Queen Camilla, about to walk into the grand hall and receive the crown that symbolized her journey from outcast to queen. He thought about how she had been judged and condemned, about how she had eventually been forgiven by many who had once hated her. Perhaps, he thought, she of all people might understand what it meant to carry a secret, to be defined by circumstances beyond one's control, to hope for acceptance in a world that seemed determined to reject you. Or perhaps she would hate him for what he was about to do. Perhaps she would see him as nothing more than a threat, a disruption, a troublemaker trying to destroy the ceremony that meant so much to her. Thomas did not know how she would react. He could only move forward and let the truth unfold. The clock struck noon. The ceremony was about to begin, and Thomas Ashworth said a silent prayer for his mother, for himself, for all the secrets that were finally about to see the light of day. The moment had arrived. The grand hall of the palace had been transformed into a vision of elegance and splendor that took the breath away of everyone who entered. Crystal chandeliers hung from the painted ceiling, catching the light and scattering it across the room in thousands of tiny rainbows. Flowers in shades of white and gold adorned every corner, their sweet perfume filling the air. Red velvet ropes guided the guests to their designated seats, while palace staff in immaculate uniforms stood ready to assist anyone who needed direction. The dignitaries had begun taking their places. There were prime ministers and presidents, princes and princesses from royal houses across Europe, celebrities and politicians and leaders from every walk of life. They whispered among themselves, commenting on the decorations, speculating about the ceremony, wondering what surprises the day might bring. None of them could have imagined the surprise that was actually coming. King Charles entered first as protocol demanded. He walked with the measured steps of a man who had waited his entire life for this role. His face was calm, but those who knew him well could see the emotion flickering behind his eyes. This was not just another ceremony for him. This was a celebration of his queen, the woman who had stood beside him through decades of struggle and judgment, the woman who had finally been accepted as his partner and his equal. Charles took his position on the throne, his crown already resting upon his head. The weight of it was familiar to him now, though he had spent most of his life waiting to wear it. He looked out at the assembled guests and allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. Everything was going according to plan. Everything was proceeding smoothly. Behind the scenes, Queen Camilla was making her final preparations. She stood in a small anteroom adjacent to the grand hall, surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting and the officials who would escort her to her place beside the king. Her gown was magnificent, a creation of the finest silk and lace, embroidered with tiny symbols that represented her journey and her role. Her jewelry sparkled at her throat and wrists, but the most important piece was still waiting for her in the chamber where the crown jewels were kept. Margaret, her faithful lady-in-waiting, noticed that the queen's hands were trembling slightly. "Are you all right, your majesty?" she asked softly, moving closer so that others would not hear. Camilla took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. "I keep thinking about all the people who said this day would never come," she admitted. "All the people who said I would never be accepted, never be forgiven, never stand where I am about to stand. And yet here I am." Margaret placed a gentle hand on the queen's arm. "You have earned this moment. You have more than earned it. All those years of patience, of grace under pressure, of refusing to let the hatred break you. This is your reward." Camilla nodded, though the strange feeling that had plagued her since morning had not gone away. If anything, it had grown stronger. She felt as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into something she could not see or understand. She told herself it was just nerves, just the natural anxiety that came with such a significant public event. But deep in her heart, she was not convinced. The time came for the crown to be brought from its chamber to the grand hall. This was a moment of great ceremonial importance, a tradition that dated back centuries. The crown would be carried on a velvet cushion by a senior official, escorted by guards who had been specially selected for their impeccable records and unwavering loyalty. Thomas Ashworth was among those guards. He fell into position with the others, his movements practiced and precise. The senior official lifted the crown from its cushion with gloved hands and placed it carefully on the ceremonial pillow. The diamonds caught the light and seemed to glow with an inner fire. Thomas found himself staring at them, mesmerized by their beauty, by the power they represented, by the history they carried within their facets. The procession began moving through the palace corridors, heading toward the grand hall. Thomas walked beside the crown, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face betraying nothing of the storm raging inside him. Other guards walked ahead and behind, scanning for any sign of threat, ready to respond to any emergency. They did not suspect that the threat was walking among them. Thomas thought about his mother, alone in her hospital room, watching the ceremony on television. She would be looking for him, knowing that he was somewhere in the palace, wondering if he would keep his promise. He imagined her face, thin and pale from illness, but her eyes still bright with hope. She had given him so much over the years. She had sacrificed her own happiness to give him a stable home, a loving family, a future. And she had kept the secret of his birth for decades, carrying the weight alone, never asking for anything in return. Until now. Now she was asking him for one thing, the truth, the simple, complicated, devastating truth. And Thomas was determined to give it to her no matter what it cost him. The procession entered the grand hall, and the assembled guests rose to their feet. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd as they caught sight of the crown. It was truly magnificent, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that had been created centuries ago and had graced the heads of queens throughout history. And soon, it would be placed on the head of Camilla, the woman who had waited so long for this honor. The crown was placed on a small table near the throne, where it would wait until the appropriate moment in the ceremony. Thomas took his position nearby, standing at attention, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. The ceremony began with speeches and music and the formal pronouncements that marked such occasions. The words washed over Thomas like waves against a shore, familiar yet meaningless. He was not listening. He was waiting. Queen Camilla entered the grand hall to a fanfare of trumpets. She walked slowly down the center aisle, her head held high, her expression serene. The guests watched her with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Many of them had known her during the dark years, when her name was synonymous with scandal and betrayal. They had watched her transformation with varying degrees of acceptance. Some had forgiven her long ago, others still harbored resentment. But all of them could acknowledge that she had shown remarkable resilience in the face of relentless criticism. Camilla reached the throne and took her place beside Charles. They exchanged a glance, a private moment of connection in the midst of the public spectacle. In that look was decades of shared history, of love that had survived unimaginable pressure, of partnership that had only grown stronger through adversity. Whatever the world thought of them, whatever judgments had been passed, they had found in each other something that nothing could destroy. The ceremony continued, each ritual following the ancient patterns that had been observed for generations. The archbishop spoke words of blessing. Choirs sang hymns of praise. The crowd sat in respectful silence, witnesses to a moment of historical significance. And then the moment arrived. The archbishop stepped forward and lifted the crown from its cushion. The hall fell completely silent. Every eye was fixed on the glittering symbol of royal authority as it was carried toward the queen. Camilla lowered her head, preparing to receive the crown, her heart full of emotions she could barely contain. Thomas felt his body begin to move before his mind had fully processed the decision. It was as if something deeper than thought had taken control, some primal need for truth and recognition that could no longer be suppressed. He stepped out of his position, breaking the careful formation of guards that surrounded the crown. His movements were swift and sudden, catching everyone by surprise. The archbishop froze, the crown still in his hands. Other guards reached for their weapons, their training kicking in even as their minds struggled to understand what was happening. Gasps and screams erupted from the crowd as they saw the young guard approaching the archbishop with a determined look on his face. Thomas reached out and took the crown from the archbishop's hands. The old man did not resist, too shocked to react. Thomas held the crown before him, looking at it with an expression that was not triumphant or threatening, but simply sad. So sad. The sadness of a man who had carried a secret for too long, who had finally reached the breaking point. "Stop!" someone shouted. "Guards! Seize him!" But Thomas did not run. He did not try to escape. He simply stood there, holding the crown, waiting for the chaos around him to settle enough for him to speak. The other guards surrounded him, their hands on their weapons, but something in his manner made them hesitate. This was not the behavior of a thief or a madman. This was something else entirely. King Charles rose from his throne, his face a mask of controlled fury and confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Who are you? What do you want?" Thomas turned to face the king, and, for a moment, their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them, some flicker of recognition that neither of them could explain. Thomas swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry, his heart pounding so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. "My name is Thomas Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "I have served as a royal guard for 6 years. My father and grandfather served before me, or at least, that is what I always believed." Camilla had risen from her seat, her face pale with shock. She looked at the young man holding her crown, trying to understand what was happening, trying to make sense of this impossible situation. Her strange feeling from the morning had crystallized into something cold and heavy in her stomach. Whatever was coming, she knew it would change everything. Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his courage. "But I recently learned a truth that has been hidden for 28 years. A truth about my birth, my blood, my identity. I am not here to steal this crown or to cause harm to anyone. I am here because my mother is dying, and she made me promise to speak the truth before it is too late." The crowd murmured and stirred, confusion and curiosity mixing with fear. Security personnel were speaking urgently into their radios, but no one made a move to tackle Thomas. The situation was too strange, too unprecedented. No one knew how to respond. Thomas looked around the hall, at the faces of the powerful and privileged who had gathered to celebrate this ceremony. He saw fear in some eyes, anger in others, but also curiosity and something that might have been compassion. He took a deep breath and prepared to speak the words that would change everything. 29 years ago, my mother was a young woman working at one of the royal estates. She met a man there, a man she fell in love with. Their affair was brief and secret, and when it ended, she discovered she was pregnant. She could not tell anyone the truth. She married James Ashworth, a good man who knew everything but raised me as his own son. She has kept this secret all these years, never asking for anything, never seeking recognition or compensation. But now she is dying, and she wanted me to know who I really am. The silence in the hall was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Every ear was straining to hear what would come next. Thomas looked directly at King Charles. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke the words that had burned inside him for years. The man who fathered me, the man whose blood runs through my veins, is connected to this family. I have proof. Documents, photographs, witnesses who can verify the truth. I am not asking for anything except acknowledgement. I am not here to claim any title or inheritance. I only want the truth to be known, for my mother's sake, for my own sake. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel. King Charles stared at the young man before him, his mind racing through possibilities and implications. He thought of all the secrets his family had guarded over the years, all the scandals that had been carefully managed and concealed. Could this be another one? Could this young guard truly be connected to the royal bloodline? Queen Camilla watched the scene unfolding with a mixture of horror and strange understanding. She knew what it meant to be caught up in a scandal, to have your private life exposed to public scrutiny. She knew the pain of being judged and condemned. And looking at this young man, this guard who had risked everything to speak a truth he had been forced to hide, she felt something unexpected stir in her heart. Not anger, not outrage, but compassion. The security personnel had received their orders and were moving closer to Thomas. He saw them approaching but did not resist. He had done what he came to do. He had spoken the words that had been locked inside him for too long. Whatever happened next, at least he had kept his promise to his mother. I will go with them peacefully, Thomas said, his voice calm and resigned. I am not here to cause a scene or to hurt anyone. I only wanted to be heard. I only wanted the truth to be acknowledged. He carefully placed the crown back on its cushion, treating it with the reverence it deserved. The diamonds sparkled in the light, untarnished and unblemished by what had just occurred. It was just a thing, Thomas thought. A beautiful, powerful thing, but still just a thing. The real treasure was not the crown, but the truth he had finally spoken. The guards took him by the arms and began leading him away. The crowd watched in stunned silence, still trying to process what they had witnessed. Thomas walked with his head held high, not in arrogance but in the dignity of a man who had finally claimed his own story. As he passed by Queen Camilla, he paused for just a moment. Their eyes met, and, in that brief glance, something passed between them. Understanding, perhaps. Recognition of a shared experience of being judged and found wanting. Or maybe just the simple human connection between two people who had both struggled to find their place in a world that often seemed determined to keep them out. I am sorry, Thomas said softly. I never wanted to hurt you. I only wanted to be seen. Camilla did not reply, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She watched as the guards led him away, disappearing through a side door that would take him to detention and questioning and an uncertain future. And she stood there, unable to move, trying to understand what had just happened and what it meant for her, for Charles, for the entire royal family. The ceremony had ground to a complete halt. The guests were murmuring among themselves, speculation and gossip spreading like wildfire. The media would already be reporting on the incident, Thomas knew. Within hours, his face would be on every screen in the country. His story would be dissected and analyzed. His claims would be investigated. And the royal family would have to decide how to respond. King Charles made a decision. He raised his hand for silence, and the hall gradually quieted. His face was composed, revealing nothing of the turmoil he must have been feeling inside. He was king, and kings did not show weakness, did not reveal their doubts or fears to the world. "We will continue with the ceremony," Charles announced, his voice steady and authoritative. "What has occurred today will be investigated thoroughly, but we will not allow this disruption to prevent us from honoring the traditions we have gathered to celebrate." There were murmurs of approval and support from the crowd. Some nodded vigorously, glad to see the king taking control of the situation. Others exchanged uncertain glances, wondering if carrying on was really the best course of action. But no one openly objected. The archbishop stepped forward again, lifting the crown with hands that trembled slightly. He approached Queen Camilla, who had returned to her position beside the throne. Her face was pale but composed, her eyes dry, her chin lifted with determination. She would not let this moment be taken from her. She had worked too hard, waited too long, endured too much to let it be stolen by one desperate young man's confession. The crown was placed upon her head. It felt heavier than she had expected, though she knew the weight was not purely physical. She carried now not only the crown but the burden of whatever truth Thomas Ashworth had brought into their lives. She carried the questions that would follow, the investigations that would occur, the judgments that would be made. The crowd applauded, the sound echoing off the high ceilings of the grand hall. Camilla smiled and waved, performing the role she had practiced for years. But inside, her thoughts were with the young man who had been led away in handcuffs. Inside, she was wondering who he really was and what his story would mean for her family. The ceremony continued, but it had lost its joy. The music seemed hollow, the speeches empty, the rituals meaningless. Everyone was thinking about what had happened, wondering about the claims that had been made, speculating about the identity of the man who had allegedly fathered the young guard. When the ceremony finally ended and the guests began to disperse, Camilla retreated to her private chambers. She removed the crown from her head and placed it carefully on its stand, looking at it as if seeing it for the first time. The diamonds still sparkled, the gold still gleamed, but she could no longer look at it without thinking of Thomas Ashworth's sad eyes, his trembling voice, his desperate need to be acknowledged. Charles found her there, standing alone in the fading afternoon light. He entered the room silently and stood beside her, looking at the crown that had caused such turmoil. "What do we do now?" Camilla asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been resignation or determination or both. "We find out the truth. We investigate his claims. And we deal with whatever we discover." Camilla turned to look at her husband, the man she had loved through decades of struggle and secrecy. "And if his claims are true, if he really is connected to this family?" Charles met her gaze steadily. "Then we face that truth together, as we have faced everything else." Outside the palace, the world was buzzing with speculation. News cameras captured images of Thomas Ashworth being taken away by security. Reporters delivered breathless accounts of the unprecedented scene in the Grand Hall. Social media exploded with theories and accusations and demands for answers. The royal family, which had weathered so many storms over the years, was facing yet another challenge to its carefully constructed image of unity and propriety. In a hospital room far from the palace, an elderly woman watched the news coverage with tears streaming down her face. She had seen her son step forward. She had heard him speak the words she had carried in secret for so long. And whatever happened next, she felt a peace that she had not known for decades. The truth was finally out. Her son had been brave enough to claim his identity, no matter the cost. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks for her son, for his courage, for the truth that had finally broken free. And, in a detention cell beneath the palace, Thomas Ashworth sat alone, waiting for whatever would come next. He had done what he had set out to do. He had spoken the truth. Now all he could do was wait and see how the world would respond. The crown had been seized. The confession had been made. And the stunning reason behind it all was only beginning to unfold. The evening descended upon London like a heavy curtain, bringing with it a cold wind that rattled the windows of the palace. Inside, the atmosphere was tense and charged with uncertainty. Staff members whispered in corridors, exchanging rumors and speculation. Security had been increased, with additional guards posted at every entrance and exit. The press had gathered outside the gates in growing numbers, their cameras flashing, their questions shouted into the indifferent darkness. Queen Camilla had not left her chambers since the ceremony ended. She sat in her favorite chair, the one that looked out over the garden she had loved since first coming to the palace. The garden was dark now, the flowers invisible in the shadow, but she could picture them clearly in her mind. She had spent many peaceful hours walking those paths, finding moments of tranquility amid the chaos of royal life. Now there was no tranquility to be found. Her mind kept returning to Thomas Ashworth, to the look in his eyes when he had spoken of his mother, to the pain in his voice when he had asked only to be acknowledged. She thought about her own journey, about the years when she had been denied acknowledgement, when she had been forced to exist in the shadows while the world passed judgment on her relationship with Charles. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the royal family, what it meant to want recognition. She understood the pain of being made to feel invisible, unwanted, unworthy. And, while she could not condone what Thomas had done, while she recognized that his actions had been disruptive and possibly criminal, she could not bring herself to hate him for them. Charles had gone to meet with his advisors, to discuss how the palace would respond to the crisis. There were legal considerations, public relations strategies, historical precedents to review. The machinery of the monarchy was grinding into action, doing what it always did when faced with scandal, protecting the institution at all costs. But Camilla was not thinking about the institution. She was thinking about a young man who had risked everything for a chance to know who he really was. She was thinking about his mother, dying in some hospital room, watching her son be led away in handcuffs. She was thinking about the weight of secrets, about how they crushed the souls of those who carried them. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret entered, carrying a tray with tea and a small plate of food that Camilla knew she would not touch. "How are you feeling, Your Majesty?" Margaret asked, setting the tray down with her usual careful grace. Camilla sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of her being. "Confused," she admitted. "Uncertain. Not sure what to think or feel." Margaret nodded sympathetically. "The whole palace is in an uproar. No one knows what to make of the young man's claims." "Do you believe them?" Camilla asked, surprising herself with the question. "Do you believe he is telling the truth about his parentage?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "I believe he believes it," she said finally. "I saw his face when he spoke. That was not the face of a liar or a madman. That was the face of someone who has been carrying a burden too heavy to bear." Camilla nodded slowly. "Yes," she agreed. "That is what I saw too." They sat together in silence, two women who had witnessed something extraordinary and were still trying to make sense of it. Outside, the wind continued to blow, and the cameras continued to flash, and the world continued to demand answers that no one yet had to give. In the detention area beneath the palace, Thomas Ashworth was being questioned by security personnel. They had taken his uniform and given him plain clothes to wear. They had searched him thoroughly, finding nothing except a photograph in his pocket, old and worn, showing a young woman holding a baby, his mother holding him, the photograph that had started everything. The interrogators were firm but not cruel. They asked him questions about his motives, his plans, his alleged evidence. Thomas answered everything honestly, holding nothing back. He told them about his mother's affair, about the revelation of his true parentage, about his promise to her as she lay dying. He gave them names, dates, details that could be verified or disproven. The interrogators listened with professional detachment, recording everything, making notes, exchanging glances that Thomas could not read. They did not tell him whether they believed him or not. They did not reveal anything about what investigation might already be underway. They simply gathered information methodically and thoroughly, doing their jobs. When the questioning was over, Thomas was taken to a small cell where he would be held while the authorities decided what to do with him. It was clean and simple, with a bed, a sink, and nothing else. He lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling strangely at peace despite everything. He had done it. He had spoken the truth in front of the most powerful people in the country. He had held the Queen's crown in his hands and demanded to be seen. Whatever happened next, at least he had kept his promise. At least his mother could rest knowing that her secret was no longer a secret. His thoughts drifted to Queen Camilla, to the moment when their eyes had met as he was being led away. He had seen something in her gaze that had surprised him. Not hatred or disgust, but something softer, something that looked almost like understanding. He wondered if she, of all people, might be capable of seeing his side of the story. He wondered if she might become an unlikely ally in his quest for truth. But he pushed those thoughts away. It was foolish to hope for such things. The royal family would circle the wagons, as they always did. They would protect their image, deny his claims, destroy his reputation if necessary. He was a nobody, a commoner, a disruption to be eliminated. Hoping for their compassion was hoping for something that would never come. And yet, a small flame of hope continued to flicker in his heart, because he had seen the look in the Queen's eyes, and he could not convince himself that it had meant nothing. The night wore on. The palace slowly quieted as staff members retired to their quarters, and the immediate crisis settled into a state of waiting. The press remained outside the gates, maintaining their vigil, hoping for any scrap of new information. The world waited, as Thomas waited, as the royal family waited, for whatever morning would bring. In her hospital bed, Thomas's mother slipped in and out of consciousness. The doctors had told her family that she did not have much time left, perhaps days, perhaps hours. But she was not afraid. She had seen her son speak his truth. She had watched him stand before kings and queens and demand recognition. She could let go now, knowing that the secret she had carried for so long was finally free. She dreamed of the young man she had loved so briefly, so intensely, so foolishly. She dreamed of the baby she had held in her arms, knowing that he would never know his true father. She dreamed of the life she had built with James Ashworth, the good man who had given her son a name and a home. And she dreamed of Thomas, her beautiful, brave Thomas, who had finally found the courage to claim his birthright. The machines beside her bed beeped softly, monitoring her failing vital signs. A nurse checked on her periodically, adjusting her medications, making her comfortable. The television in the corner of the room was turned off now, but its earlier images played in her memory like a movie. Her son, holding the Queen's crown. Her son, speaking words she had never dared to speak. Her son finally free. She smiled in her sleep, a peaceful smile, a smile of completion. Whatever happened next, she had done what she needed to do. She had raised a son who was brave enough to face the truth. She had loved him with everything she had. And now finally, she could rest. The first light of dawn crept over London, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day was beginning. A day that would bring more questions, more revelations, more turmoil. But, for now, in the quiet hours before the world woke up, there was a moment of stillness, a breath of peace before the storm. And somewhere in the palace, Queen Camilla lay awake in her bed, watching the light grow stronger, thinking about the young man in the cell beneath her feet, wondering what the truth really was and whether she would have the courage to face it when it finally emerged. The crown sat on its stand across the room, catching the first rays of sunlight, glittering with all its ancient glory. But to Camilla, it no longer looked like a symbol of power and triumph. It looked like a reminder of all the secrets that lay beneath the surface of the royal family, all the truths that had been buried and hidden and denied. Today, some of those truths would begin to emerge. Today, the investigation would begin in earnest. Today, the world would start to learn whether Thomas Ashworth's claims were true or false, and what the implications might be for the monarchy and the nation. Camilla closed her eyes and said a silent prayer. Not for herself, not for the crown, not for the institution she had worked so hard to join, but for a young man who had risked everything for the chance to know who he really was, and for his dying mother, who had carried a secret for too long. The day was coming, the truth was waiting, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning news programs exploded with coverage of the incident. Every channel, every network, every website led with the same story. A royal guard had seized the Queen's crown during a major ceremony. He had made extraordinary claims about his parentage. He was being held in custody while the palace investigated. The whole country was gripped by the most sensational royal scandal in decades. Reporters stood outside the hospital where Thomas's mother lay dying, hoping to interview family members or medical staff. Others had stationed themselves outside the small house where Thomas had grown up, knocking on neighbors' doors, asking questions about the young man who had shocked the nation. The hunger for information was insatiable, and the media was determined to uncover every detail of Thomas Ashworth's life and claims. Inside the palace, a very different kind of investigation was underway. A team of senior officials had been assembled, including legal advisors, security experts, and historians who understood the complicated genealogies of the royal family. Their task was simple in description but enormously complex in execution. Determine whether Thomas Ashworth's claims had any basis in truth. The first piece of evidence they examined was the photograph that had been found in Thomas's pocket. It showed a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, holding an infant. The woman's face was partially obscured, but her features were visible enough for identification. The baby was wrapped in a blue blanket, looking up at the camera with unfocused newborn eyes. On the back of the photograph, a date was written in faded ink. The date corresponded to approximately 9 months after the period when Thomas's mother claimed to have had her affair. The handwriting was analyzed and confirmed to be that of Thomas's mother. So far, the physical evidence was consistent with his story. The next step was to trace Thomas's mother's employment history. Records from the royal estate where she claimed to have worked were retrieved from archives. They confirmed that a young woman by her name had indeed been employed there during the relevant time period. She had worked as a kitchen assistant, a position that would have given her access to various areas of the estate and potentially to members of the royal household. The investigators exchanged meaningful glances as each piece of evidence fell into place. The story was beginning to look more credible with each passing hour. But they needed more than employment records and photographs. They needed to identify who the alleged father might be and whether he had ever had the opportunity to meet Thomas's mother. This was where the investigation became delicate. The official leading the inquiry knew that he was treading on dangerous ground. Any suggestion that a member of the royal family had fathered an illegitimate child would be explosive. Even investigating such a possibility could be seen as an attack on the monarchy. He would have to proceed carefully, documenting everything, ensuring that his methods could withstand the scrutiny that would inevitably follow. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla had requested a briefing on the investigation's progress. She sat in her private study, listening as the lead investigator summarized what had been discovered so far. Her face remained impassive throughout the presentation, giving no indication of her thoughts or feelings. Only her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, revealed any sign of tension. "So his story appears to be credible," she said when the investigator had finished. "His mother did work at the estate during the time she claims. The photograph is genuine. What else have you found?" The investigator hesitated. "Your Majesty, the next phase of the investigation will involve sensitive inquiries. We will need to examine records from that period more closely, interview people who may have witnessed interactions." Camilla understood what he was not saying. The investigation was about to delve into the private affairs of the royal family, searching for evidence of an illicit relationship that might have produced a child. It was exactly the kind of scrutiny that the monarchy worked so hard to avoid. "Do what you need to do," she said quietly. We cannot leave this matter unresolved. The speculation will only grow worse if we appear to be hiding something. The investigator nodded and departed. Camilla remained in her study, thinking about what she had learned. If Thomas's story was true, then somewhere in the royal family tree was a connection to this young man who had disrupted her coronation ceremony. Somewhere was a father who had either known about his son and abandoned him or had never been told of his existence at all. She thought about what it must have been like for Thomas's mother, discovering she was pregnant with a child whose father could never acknowledge her. She thought about the choices that woman must have faced, the doors that must have closed in her face, the judgment she must have endured from those who suspected the truth. It was not so different, really, from Camilla's own experience. Both of them had been caught up in situations that society deemed unacceptable. Both of them had paid a heavy price for loving the wrong person at the wrong time. The compassion she had felt the day before returned, stronger now. She found herself hoping that the investigation would reveal the truth, whatever it might be. Not because she wanted to protect the monarchy or manage the scandal, but because she believed that Thomas Ashworth deserved to know who his father was. After everything he had done, everything he had risked, he deserved that much. In his cell beneath the palace, Thomas was unaware of these developments. He had been given breakfast and told nothing about what was happening above him. He sat on his bed, trying to prepare himself for whatever came next. He knew that his actions had been illegal, that he could face serious charges. But he also knew that he had done what he had to do. He had no regrets. A guard came to his cell around mid-morning and informed him that he had a visitor. Thomas's heart leaped, hoping it might be someone with news about his mother. He was led to a small interview room, where a woman in a conservative suit was waiting for him. She introduced herself as Elizabeth Thornton, a lawyer who had been appointed to represent him. She was calm and professional, but Thomas could see genuine concern in her eyes. She explained that she had been following the case and had offered her services because she believed he deserved proper representation. The palace has not yet decided what charges to pursue, she told him. Your case is unusual. There are legal questions about whether your actions constitute theft, since you never attempted to remove the crown from the palace, and you returned it voluntarily. There are also questions about your mental state at the time, which could affect any charges. Thomas shook his head firmly. I am not mentally ill. I knew exactly what I was doing. I made a choice to speak the truth in a place where I knew I would be heard. Elizabeth nodded slowly. I understand. But the palace may be reluctant to prosecute aggressively if your claims turn out to be true. A trial would bring even more attention to the matter, and they may prefer to resolve this quietly. I do not want it resolved quietly, Thomas said, his voice rising with emotion. I want the truth to be known. I want my mother to die knowing that her son was not denied his identity. Elizabeth placed a gentle hand on his arm. I understand your feelings, but we need to be strategic. If the investigation confirms your claims, you will have much more leverage than if you are sitting in prison on criminal charges. Let me help you navigate this. Let me help you get the acknowledgement you deserve. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. He had been so focused on making his statement that he had not thought much about what came next. He had assumed he would be punished, perhaps imprisoned. His claims dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed man. The possibility that he might actually achieve his goal seemed almost too much to hope for. How is my mother? He asked finally. Have you heard anything? Elizabeth's expression softened. I spoke to the hospital this morning. She is stable but very weak. The doctors say she could go at any time. She has been asking about you. Tears welled up in Thomas's eyes. The thought of his mother lying alone in a hospital bed, wondering what had happened to her son, was almost more than he could bear. He had done this for her, and now he could not even be with her in her final hours. Is there any way I could see her? He asked, his voice breaking. Before the end? Elizabeth's face was sympathetic but realistic. I will try to arrange something, but it will depend on the palace's willingness to cooperate. They are very sensitive about any perception that they are treating you well or accepting your claims. Thomas nodded, understanding but frustrated. He was caught in a web of politics and public relations, and his mother's last days were being affected by considerations that had nothing to do with love or family. The interview ended, and Thomas was returned to his cell. He lay on his bed and thought about his mother, about the life she had lived, about the sacrifices she had made. She had given up so much for him. She had kept silent when speaking might have brought her money or recognition. She had protected him from the truth until he was old enough to handle it. And she had never, not once, made him feel that his existence was anything less than a blessing. He wished he could tell her how much he loved her. He wished he could hold her hand and thank her for everything she had done. He wished the walls of the cell would disappear and let him fly to her side. But wishes were not horses, and beggars could not ride. He could only wait and hope that somehow, before it was too late, he would have the chance to say goodbye. The investigation continued throughout the day, gathering momentum as more evidence came to light. Witnesses were identified who had worked at the estate during the relevant period. Some of them were tracked down and interviewed, their memories probed for any recollection of a relationship between a kitchen assistant and a member of the royal household. Most of the witnesses remembered nothing unusual. The estate had been a busy place, with dozens of staff members coming and going. A brief affair between a servant and someone of higher status would not necessarily have been noticed, especially if both parties had been careful. But one witness stood out. An elderly woman named Margaret Hughes had been the head housekeeper at the estate during that time. She was now in her 80s, living in a retirement home in the countryside. When investigators came to see her, she at first claimed to remember nothing. But, as they pressed her with questions, something in her manner suggested she knew more than she was saying. Finally, after much gentle persuasion, Margaret admitted the truth. Yes, she had known about the affair. She had discovered it accidentally, walking in on a private moment that she should not have witnessed. The young kitchen assistant and the man she was with had begged her to keep silent, and she had agreed. It was not her place to interfere in such matters, and she had no desire to cause a scandal. But who was the man? The investigator asked, his voice carefully neutral. Can you identify him? Margaret's face crumpled with distress. She had kept this secret for nearly 30 years. She had never told anyone, not even her own family. The weight of it had been heavy, but she had borne it because she believed it was the right thing to do. Now, faced with investigators who clearly already suspected the truth, she was being asked to finally speak. I cannot, she said, shaking her head. I made a promise. I gave my word. The investigator leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Hughes, a young man's identity is at stake. His mother is dying. He deserves to know the truth about who he is. Can you really continue to keep this secret, knowing what it means to him? Margaret was silent for a long time. Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks as she wrestled with her conscience. The promise she had made so long ago, the secret she had guarded so carefully, the implications of finally letting it go. It was the hardest decision of her life. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but the investigator heard every word. And, as she spoke, the last pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigative team. They had suspected, of course, based on the evidence they had gathered. But hearing it confirmed by a witness who had seen the affair with her own eyes gave the claim an undeniable weight. They would need to verify further, perhaps through DNA testing if it could be arranged. But the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The lead investigator knew that he now faced a decision that could shape the future of the monarchy. He could bury the findings, classify them as inconclusive, and recommend that Thomas Ashworth be prosecuted and discredited. The palace would certainly prefer that approach. It would contain the scandal and protect the institution. Or he could present the truth as best he understood it and let others decide what to do with it. He could recommend that the findings be shared with the appropriate members of the royal family and that steps be taken to address Thomas's claims with integrity and honesty. It was not really a difficult decision in the end. The investigator had built his career on a foundation of honesty and thoroughness. He had never buried evidence or manipulated findings to achieve a desired outcome. He was not about to start now, no matter how powerful the forces that might want him to do so. He compiled his preliminary report and requested an urgent meeting with the senior officials who had authorized the investigation. This was going to change everything. Back at the hospital, Thomas's mother took a turn for the worse. Her breathing became labored, her pulse weakened, and the doctors informed the family that the end was near. Thomas's aunt, his mother's sister, sat by the bedside, holding the dying woman's hand and whispering words of comfort. "Thomas is fine," she told her sister, though she did not know if it was true. "He is being well treated. He wants you to know that he loves you and that he is proud to be your son." The dying woman smiled faintly. She could no longer speak, but her eyes were alert, communicating what her voice could not. She seemed at peace, ready to let go, satisfied that she had done what she needed to do. In her final hours, she thought about the life she had lived, the passionate young woman she had been, falling for a man she could never have, the frightened mother she had become, discovering she was pregnant with no way to tell the father, the devoted wife she had chosen to be, building a life with James Ashworth, loving him truly even though her heart had once belonged to another, the protective mother she had remained, keeping Thomas safe from a truth that might have destroyed him. She had no regrets. She had done the best she could with the hand she had been dealt. She had loved her son with everything she had. And now, at the end, she could let go knowing that he was fighting for his identity, fighting for his truth, fighting for the acknowledgement she had been unable to give him. The machines beside her bed began to beep with increasing urgency. Nurses rushed in, but there was nothing to be done. The dying woman took one last breath, squeezed her sister's hand, and slipped peacefully away. News of her death reached Thomas within the hour. A guard came to his cell with the message, delivered with surprisingly gentle words. Thomas sat on his bed, numb with grief, unable to cry, unable to think, unable to feel anything except a vast emptiness where his mother's love had always been. She was gone. The woman who had given him life, who had protected him, who had finally encouraged him to seek his truth, was gone. He had not been able to see her one last time. He had not been able to tell her that he loved her. He had not been able to thank her for everything she had done. He thought about the promise he had made to her, the promise that had led him to this cell. He had kept it. He had spoken the truth, had demanded acknowledgement, had refused to remain silent any longer. But now, with his mother gone, the victory felt hollow. What good was acknowledgement if she was not there to see it? The grief came suddenly, like a wave crashing over him. He buried his face in his hands and wept, his body shaking with sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside him. He wept for his mother, for the life she had lived, for the secrets she had carried, for the love she had given so freely. He wept for himself, for the boy who had grown up not knowing his true father, for the man who had learned the truth too late to share it with her. He wept for all the lost years, the missed opportunities, the things that could never be said. The guards outside his cell pretended not to hear. They stood at their posts, facing away from the door, giving the grieving man what little privacy they could. Whatever else he might be, whatever crimes he might have committed, he was still a son mourning his mother. Some things transcended duty and protocol. Hours passed. Thomas's tears eventually ran dry, leaving him exhausted and empty. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about nothing and everything. The world continued to turn outside his cell, but he felt disconnected from it, floating in a void of grief and loss. When the guard came to tell him that he had another visitor, Thomas could barely summon the energy to respond. He was led back to the interview room, expecting to see his lawyer again. But the person waiting for him was someone he had never expected to see. Queen Camilla stood by the window, her back to the door, She was dressed simply, without any of the formal regalia that usually accompanied her public appearances. When she heard him enter, she turned to face him, and their eyes met for the second time. Thomas stopped in his tracks, too shocked to move. The guards who had escorted him seemed equally surprised, looking to their superiors for guidance. A senior official stepped forward and spoke quietly. Her Majesty has requested a private conversation with Mr. Ashworth. Please wait outside. The guards withdrew, leaving Thomas alone with the Queen. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, two people connected by circumstances neither of them had chosen, trying to find words for a situation that had no precedent. Camilla broke the silence first. Her voice was gentle, almost maternal. I heard about your mother. I am sorry for your loss. Thomas swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure. Thank you, Your Majesty. Please sit down, Camilla said, gesturing to the chairs around the small table. I know this must seem strange, my coming here, but I needed to speak with you. I needed to understand. They sat across from each other, the Queen and the guard who had seized her crown. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it might as well have been miles. They came from different worlds, lived by different rules, faced different expectations. And yet, in this moment, they were simply two human beings trying to make sense of something extraordinary. Why did you do it? Camilla asked. Why risk everything? Why choose such a public, dramatic way to reveal your story? Thomas thought about the question carefully before answering. Because no one would have listened otherwise. I tried other ways. I wrote letters that were never answered. I requested meetings that were never granted. The palace has very effective ways of silencing people like me, people who threaten the image they want to project. The only way to be heard was to force them to listen. Camilla nodded slowly. And your mother? She was the one who encouraged you to do this. She made me promise, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. On her deathbed, she made me promise that I would not carry this secret alone for the rest of my life. She said I deserved to know who I was. She said I deserved to be acknowledged. And do you? Camilla asked quietly. Do you believe that acknowledgement would change anything? Thomas met her gaze directly. I do not know. I do not expect to be welcomed into the family or given titles or treated as royalty. I know that is not realistic, but I believe that every person deserves to know their own story. I believe that secrets poison the people who carry them. And I believe that my mother deserved better than to die with the weight of this secret still crushing her. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. She thought about her own secrets, the things she had hidden from the world, the aspects of her life that would never be made public. She understood the weight of concealment, the cost of keeping parts of yourself locked away. The investigation has made progress, she said finally. They have found evidence that supports your claims. Witnesses who remember the affair, documents that confirm your mother's employment, other details that corroborate your story. Thomas felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. And the identity of my father? Have they confirmed that as well? Camilla hesitated. This was the question she had dreaded, the one that would change everything if she answered it honestly. She looked at the young man across from her, at his hopeful, frightened face, at the evidence of grief still visible in his reddened eyes. He deserved the truth. Whatever chaos it might cause, whatever scandal it might create, he deserved to know. Yes, she said quietly. They believe they know who your father is. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He had waited so long for this moment, had risked